My gay Arab showed me, and I loved the size. A solo trip to the Sahara Desert was supposed to be a time for reflection, a chance to find myself under the vast, golden skies. But what I found instead was him. From the moment I saw him standing against the backdrop of endless dunes, there was something about his quiet confidence that pulled me in. He didn't just guide me through the desert. He opened my eyes to a connection I never expected. His laughter echoed in the stillness of the sands, and the stories he shared made the world feel bigger than I ever imagined. It wasn't just the grandeur of the desert he revealed. It was the magnitude of his heart and the depth of emotions I never knew I could feel. Before we begin this unforgettable journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another compelling story. In the comments, let us know if you've ever met someone who changed the way you see the world. Your story could inspire others to take their own leap into the unknown. When I first arrived in Morocco, the sheer intensity of the desert overwhelmed me. The heat was fierce, the landscape both harsh and beautiful. As an American used to the bustling, cold streets of Boston, I felt completely out of place. My plan was simple: join a small tour group, ride some camels, and experience the vastness of the Sahara. I never imagined I would meet someone who would change the way I looked at everything, including myself. On my second evening, just as the sun began to set, our group was introduced to Malik. He was our local guide, tasked with leading us deeper into the desert. Malik was tall, with dark, piercing eyes and a smile that seemed to disarm everyone who crossed his path. He wore traditional robes, but it was his voice that struck me the most, deep and warm, like the desert winds. I found myself hanging on his every word. As we set off into the dunes, I kept my distance, unsure of how to interact. I wasn't used to feeling this drawn to someone so quickly. Every time Malik spoke, I caught myself leaning in, as if his voice carried a secret meant just for me. At one point, he paused our group and pointed to the horizon, explaining how the desert changed depending on the time of day. But his words blurred as I focused on his hands, the way they moved gracefully to describe the shifting sands. That night, as we set up camp under a canopy of stars, Malik seemed different. He was quieter, more introspective. I watched him sit by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. There was something almost magnetic about him, and for reasons I couldn't yet understand, I felt compelled to sit beside him. "You like the desert?" he asked, his accent adding a lilt to his words. "It's beautiful," I replied, feeling my cheeks heat as his gaze met mine. "It's nothing like what I'm used to." "You'll see. It has a way of showing you what you didn't know you were looking for," he said, his eyes twinkling. His words hit me like a gust of wind. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the desert or something more personal. As the night wore on, our conversations grew more personal. He asked about my life in America, my family, and why I chose to visit the Sahara. In turn, he shared glimpses of his own life. A childhood spent wandering these sands, his love for the quiet majesty of the dunes, and his dreams of exploring beyond them someday. By the time I lay down in my tent, I was wide awake. The image of Malik, his smile, his voice, his quiet confidence, was all I could think about. Something had shifted within me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of loneliness. Instead, I felt a spark of something new, something that scared me and excited me in equal measure. What Malik didn't know was that my trip to the Sahara wasn't just about seeing the desert. I had come here to escape, to leave behind the confusion and uncertainty I felt about myself. But now, sitting in the vast stillness of the Sahara, I realized that my journey might be about finding the courage to face those questions, and maybe even to embrace them. The next day, as the sun rose over the dunes, I knew I wanted to spend more time near Malik. I didn't know where it would lead or how he would react, but I couldn't ignore the pull I felt. It was as if the desert itself had conspired to bring us together, and I was ready to see where it would take me. The next morning the sun rose early over the Sahara, painting the dunes in a warm golden light. Malik greeted me with a smile as he prepared the camels for our next journey. His warmth was infectious, and I found myself drawn to him even more. As we set out, the desert seemed endless, a shifting sea of sand stretching as far as the eye could see. Malik walked ahead, leading the camels and sharing stories of his childhood in the desert. His voice was steady, like the rhythm of our journey, and I hung on every word. But then, halfway through the day, something changed. Malik grew quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon. I asked him what was wrong, and he gestured toward a distant ridge. "A storm is coming," he said softly. "We need to find shelter." The next hour was tense as we hurried toward a rocky outcrop. The wind picked up, whipping sand around us, and I could feel the weight of the situation settling in. Malik remained calm, guiding the camels and urging me to keep close. By the time we reached shelter, the storm was upon us. Huddled under the outcrop, the wind howled around us. Sand scraped at my skin, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. Malik reached out, placing a hand on my arm. "You're okay," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay close to me." His reassurance was more than just words. In that moment, I realized how much I trusted him. As the storm raged on, I couldn't help but feel a growing connection. He wasn't just my guide. He was someone I felt safe with, someone I wanted to know better. When the storm finally passed, we emerged from our shelter, covered in sand but relieved. Malik looked at me with a small smile, his face streaked with dust. "You did well," he said. "Not everyone handles a desert storm so calmly." I laughed softly, the tension breaking. I had a good guide. As we continued our journey, I felt a shift within myself. What had started as simple admiration for Malik had grown into something deeper, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, the sun rose early over the Sahara, painting the dunes in a warm, golden light. Malik greeted me with a smile as he prepared the camels for our next journey. His warmth was infectious, and I found myself drawn to him even more. As we set out, the desert seemed endless, a shifting sea of sand stretching as far as the eye could see. Malik walked ahead, leading the camels and sharing stories of his childhood in the desert. His voice was steady, like the rhythm of our journey, and I hung on every word. But then, halfway through the day, something changed. Malik grew quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon. I asked him what was wrong, and he gestured toward a distant ridge. "A storm is coming," he said softly. "We need to find shelter." The next hour was tense as we hurried toward a rocky outcrop. The wind picked up, whipping sand around us, and I could feel the weight of the situation settling in. Malik remained calm, guiding the camels and urging me to keep close. By the time we reached shelter, the storm was upon us. Huddled under the outcrop, the wind howled around us. Sand scraped at my skin, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. Malik reached out, placing a hand on my arm. "You're okay," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay close to me." His reassurance was more than just words. In that moment, I realized how much I trusted him. As the storm raged on, I couldn't help but feel a growing connection. He wasn't just my guide. He was someone I felt safe with, someone I wanted to know better. When the storm finally passed, we emerged from our shelter, covered in sand but relieved. Malik looked at me with a small smile, his face streaked with dust. "You did well," he said. "Not everyone handles a desert storm so calmly." I laughed softly, the tension breaking. I had a good guide. As we continued our journey, I felt a shift within myself. What had started as simple admiration for Malik had grown into something deeper, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, Malik and I prepared to cross an especially remote stretch of desert. The wind had died down, leaving the landscape eerily quiet. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. As we moved further into the dunes, Malik seemed more distant. He spoke less, his usual warmth replaced by a quiet tension. I wondered if something was troubling him, but I didn't have the courage to ask. Instead, I tried to focus on the beauty around us, the endless waves of golden sand, the faint traces of life that somehow thrived in this desolate place. Just as I was starting to relax, a distant shout broke the silence. Malik stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "Stay here," he said firmly, handing me the reins of the camels. He moved quickly, his footsteps barely disturbing the sand. I watched him disappear over a ridge, my heart pounding. Minutes felt like hours. When Malik finally returned, his expression was guarded. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tight. I didn't press him for answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. As we continued, I caught glimpses of figures in the distance, strangers whose presence felt like a shadow over our journey. Malik stayed close, his posture protective, and for the first time, I saw the desert not as a place of peace, but as a land full of unknown dangers. When we finally stopped for the evening, I felt an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with the day's travel. I wanted to understand what was happening, but Malik's closed-off demeanor made it impossible to ask. Instead, I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, hoping that the silence between us would break. After what felt like an eternity, Malik spoke. "You're not like other travelers I've guided," he said, his voice softer than before. I looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" You notice things. You listen. Most people just want to get through the desert as quickly as possible. But you..." He trailed off, his eyes meeting mine. "You care." His words were unexpected, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest. "Of course I care," I said quietly. "I care about you." For a moment, we sat in the stillness of the desert night, the firelight dancing between us. Malik's guarded expression softened, and in that instant I knew that whatever he had been holding back, he was beginning to let it go. It wasn't a declaration, but it was a start, and it left me wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, the silence was almost too much to bear. Malik and I packed up camp and set off without a word, the tension from the previous evening still hanging heavy in the air. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, how I cared. But what did he mean by that? And more importantly, what did I want it to mean? The sun climbed higher, and the day grew hotter. Malik led the way, his gaze focused on the horizon. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but I didn't know where to start. Instead, I found myself studying him, his posture, the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the dunes as if he could read the desert itself. He had been so guarded, yet I could see glimpses of vulnerability that made my chest ache. At midday, we stopped to rest under the shade of a large rock formation. Malik handed me a flask of water without a word. His expression was unreadable, but I could feel the weight of unspoken words between us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Malik," I began, my voice cracking slightly. "What you said last night, I need to know what you meant." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I meant what I said," he admitted. "You see me differently. Most people see a guide, someone to get them from one place to another, but you, He hesitated. You see me as more than that. I do, I said quietly, my heart pounding. And I want to understand you better. Malik's gaze softened, and I saw a flicker of something I hadn't noticed before. Hope. Maybe, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want that too. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to give me the courage to keep going. As we resumed our journey, the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was filled with possibility. And as the sun began to set, casting the desert in hues of gold and pink, I realized that whatever happened next, I was ready to embrace it. The next morning, the air was still, and the vast horizon seemed to stretch endlessly. Malik and I packed our things without much conversation, but the weight of the previous days lingered between us. Every time I glanced at him, I caught him doing the same, quick, almost shy looks that made my chest tighten. We walked in silence for most of the day, the desert around us vast and unyielding. When we finally stopped to rest near a dry, cracked wadi, Malik turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. I need to tell you something, he began, his voice low. Before we go any further. My pulse quickened. What is it? He hesitated, looking down at the sand. I haven't been completely honest with you. There are parts of my life I've kept hidden. Things I'm not proud of. I watched him carefully, unsure of where he was going. What do you mean? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Malik finally looked at me, his eyes searching mine. I wasn't just leading you through the desert. I was also trying to protect you. There are people out here who wouldn't want us to be here. People who don't understand. His words hit me like a sudden gust of wind. I stepped closer, my concern outweighing my confusion. Malik, you've been watching out for me this whole time? He nodded. I couldn't just let you walk into something dangerous. I needed to be sure you'd be okay. I felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, guilt, and something deeper I couldn't quite name. Why didn't you tell me before? Malik's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability behind his calm demeanor. I didn't know how you'd react. I thought it might scare you away. I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. Malik, I trust you. I've trusted you since the moment we met. You don't have to protect me alone. He smiled faintly, the tension easing from his face. Thank you. As the sun began to set, the golden light casting long shadows across the sand, we sat together on the edge of the wadi. Malik shared more about his life, his struggles, his hopes, and his fears. For the first time, I felt like I truly knew him, and I couldn't help but feel that this journey wasn't just about crossing the desert. It was about crossing into something deeper, something that neither of us had planned, but both of us were beginning to embrace. When the stars came out, I reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he held on, his grip steady and warm. In that moment, I realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, we could face them together. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. The stars above seemed to watch over us as Malik and I prepared for the final leg of our journey. The desert night was cold, but the warmth between us was enough to keep the chill at bay. As we walked side by side, I felt a quiet sense of belonging I hadn't known before. As the days went on, the lines between guide and traveler, between two strangers from different worlds, blurred further. We talked about our dreams, our fears, and the lives we left behind. Malik's laughter was a sound I cherished, a melody that made the desert feel alive. He told me of a life he imagined, a life where he didn't have to hide, where he could be free, and I found myself wanting to be a part of that dream. But the desert has a way of testing you. Just as we began to feel secure, we encountered a small group of travelers heading the opposite direction. Their curious gazes lingered on us, and for a moment I saw Malik's smile falter. The world outside the desert still held its judgments, its rules. Yet, as soon as they passed, Malik looked at me and squeezed my hand, as if to say, "I choose you." On the final night before reaching the edge of the desert, we sat by the fire once more. Malik leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "This is where our journey ends," he said, "but it's not where I want us to end." His words filled me with a mixture of hope and fear. I thought of everything that waited beyond the dunes, my life back home, the expectations, the uncertainties. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. Malik was the reason I had come to the desert, even if I hadn't known it at the time. "I don't want us to end either," I said softly. When we finally reached the town on the desert's edge, it felt bittersweet. The world was louder, busier, and yet Malik's presence grounded me. We parted ways with promises to see each other again. The thought of leaving him made my chest ache, but as he held me close and whispered, "We'll find each other," I believed him. As I boarded the bus that would take me back to the city, I glanced back at Malik standing among the dunes. His silhouette was steady, unyielding, and I knew that no matter where I went, a piece of the desert and a piece of him would stay with me forever. As I think back on my time in the Sahara, what lingers most isn't just the breathtaking vistas or the sunrises that painted the sand dunes gold. It's not just the way the stars seemed brighter than anywhere else I'd ever been, or how the quiet of the desert could feel so deafeningly loud. What lingers most is Malik and everything he showed me about myself. I went to the desert seeking something I couldn't name. A break from my routine, sure. A little adventure, maybe. But deep down, I think I was searching for clarity. For a way to quiet the noise in my head and reconnect with what truly mattered. What I found instead was someone who taught me that clarity isn't always about answers. Sometimes it's about questions, about having the courage to ask them, even if you're not sure you'll like the answers you'll find. Meeting Malik forced me to confront parts of myself I had ignored for years. His calm confidence, his quiet warmth, his ability to see me for who I was, even when I tried to hide, all of it broke through the walls I had built. I didn't realize how guarded I'd become until I found someone willing to meet me behind those walls. And when he did, I discovered parts of myself I hadn't dared to look at before. There were moments in the desert when everything felt so simple. Just him and me, walking through an endless sea of sand. In those moments, I didn't have to think about the life I'd left behind, or the expectations waiting for me back home. I could just be. With him, I felt a freedom I didn't even know I needed. I felt seen in a way that made me want to see myself more clearly. I wanted to be as open and honest with him as he was with me. And in doing so, I began to understand that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. It makes you human. But the desert isn't just a place of serenity. It's a place of tests. It challenges you. It strips away everything you thought you needed and forces you to rely on something deeper. Malik showed me that too, not just through his words, but through his actions. He didn't just guide me through the physical terrain of the Sahara. He guided me through my own emotional landscape. He showed me how to confront fear and doubt, how to find strength in the very things that made me feel fragile. When the time came to leave, the ache I felt wasn't just for the desert or the beauty I was leaving behind. It was for the bond we had built, the connection that had grown in the most unlikely of places. And yet, as painful as that parting was, it was also a gift. Because it taught me that some connections aren't meant to be permanent. They're meant to change you, to shape you into someone stronger, someone who can carry that love and that learning forward into whatever comes next. In the end, the Sahara gave me what I didn't know I was looking for. It gave me the chance to understand that love, whether fleeting or lasting, has the power to transform. It showed me that sometimes the most important journeys aren't about reaching a destination. They're about the steps you take along the way, the people you meet, and the courage you find within yourself. As I move forward, I'll carry those lessons with me. I'll remember Malik's smile, his laughter, the steady strength of his hand in mine. I'll remember that clarity isn't about having all the answers. It's about embracing the questions. And I'll hold on to the knowledge that love, in all its forms, is worth the risk. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you thought of this journey, and if you've ever had a life-changing experience like this one, your story might just inspire someone else to take their own leap into the unknown.